The first person I would like to welcome is Dr. Jason Shahin from Montreal. Jason's an assistant professor at McGill, where he did his training in pulmonary and critical care medicine, followed by doing MSc in epidemiology and a fellowship in research in London. Jason's now an assistant professor doing research focusing on risk prediction in the ICU, and is going to speak to us about the work he's been doing on the impact of withdrawal of life-sustaining measures procedures in predicting time of death in DCD. So welcome and thank you very much, Jason.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm excited to talk to you today about some of the research we've been doing. So really today we'll have two questions that we'll address. Basic questions, nothing complicated. When do we die and how we die? So all jokes aside, we won't talk about the philosophical issues, but how this relates to DCD. The first question, when do we die, really comes out of the barriers for DCD, which most of you are probably aware of, things like the time required to confirm death, auto-resuscitation, violation of the dead donor rule, but more specifically to my work, the time to death prediction and the warm ischemia time. So, a DCD overview, just to make sure we're all on the same page. When we talk about DCD, we talk about a patient who comes into the ICU with a lethal injury, maybe a car crash. Patient has a poor prognosis, and we decide to withdraw life support therapy, life support measures, because the patient has poor prognosis. So we start with a conversation about withdrawal. We then move on then to donation, and then the act of withdrawal of life support measures happen. From that point on, until the patient dies, is considered the warm ischemia time. And that is a time that we would like to predict. The reason that if the time takes more than 2 hours, give or take, depending on the organ, that organ is not generally considered to be retrievable, and that's still under debate. And so it's important to figure out if we can predict that warm ischemia time. If the patient does not die in time, there is a waste of resources, being either the surgical group who's come for the procurement of the organs, the OR time, and maybe as important as the family expectation, who will undergo this loss of hoping their loved one could some good come out of their misadventure, and unfortunately the patient cannot donate. So in terms of prediction tools, we undertook a few years ago a systematic review to look at these tools, and I won't go through them with you, but there have been numerous tools. The problem is that most of them are single-centered, small studies, and some statistical issues with them. So we undertook this project as a sub-study of the DPART study, which you heard at lunch, with the research question, can we predict time to death? And specifically, can we develop a model that can predict time to death from WLSM, withdrawal of life support measures, to death in the DCD donor? So this is a bit of a rehash of the DCD, of the DPART study, but it was a prospective observational study. We included in our group 306 patients. There was a larger 600-patient group, but we wanted patients who were DCD eligible, and that ended up being 306 patients from 19 ICUs in Canada, the Czech Republic, and Netherlands. Again, this is a slide you saw at lunch. This is data we collected specifically for the prediction tool. We looked at first patients' demographics and their comorbidities. We would include those as variables. We looked at lab data and their Apache score. We looked at interventions, specifically circulatory interventions, what they did with the vasopressors, pharmacological interventions like opioids, and respiratory interventions, what they did with the ventilator. And then finally, we gathered more physiological data around the time of withdrawal that we would use as predictors. So I want to go over a bit of the statistical work that we did, because I think it's important to understand these prediction tools. And basically, we had two philosophies that we approached. We decided to do a classical regression model and a machine learning model. And that machine learning used something called a random forest ensemble, which I'll explain to you. So the first is the classical approach. When people do a regression, when people do a prediction tool, they basically gather this data, they gather the predictors, the important predictors, and they basically select them out either a priori or through statistical tests. If they hit a certain p-value, they'll include that predictor in their model. They run it through a logistic regression model, through some statistics, and at the end, they take that model, they prune it down, again, using p-values and stats, to get a parsimonious model. It's a hard word to say, but basically a nice, clean, easy model. So we did not do that in our classical approach. The problem with doing that approach is that you're tailoring your model using p-values. And so let me explain, and a lot of the previous models have done that, and this is the problem you get into. It's called overfitting, which is a statistical term. Now, my brain doesn't work so well, so I'll tell you how I understand this problem. Let's say you take a picture of myself. Oh, sorry, that's Arnold. And so let's assume that, I don't know why you're all laughing, but anyway, let's assume that this is my sample population where we're doing our model. And we want to build, we're tailors. We want to build Arnold a suit. We're statistical tailors. So we measure Arnold and we make him a nice, beautiful suit. He looks very handsome. His biceps, his suit is beautifully tailored to his biceps. He has small legs, classically, so we really narrowed it down and we cut and we pruned everything perfectly. So we now have this beautiful tailored suit, or model, and now we take it to the general population, who looks more like this. We take our beautiful suit, we put it on this guy, and we get something like this, where it doesn't fit. And that's what a lot of the previous classical models happens when you take them to, they're non-generalizable because of this overfitting. Said maybe a bit more scientifically, you get something like this, where you have data that's scattered, and you basically make your model so it connects every point. That's overfitting. And when you do this approach of cutting out these variables based on p-values, you get that. So we try to avoid that. So we just took our models a priori, which I'll show you in a second. The machine learning, using the random forest, basically is a purely statistically driven model. And the way I understand it, again, is you have a bowl of fruits. You have some cherries, you have some oranges, and you have some apples. And you want to divide them. So you create a tree. And the tree says, well, I'll separate out these fruits based on their diameter. Okay, the cherries fall off, I'm left with the oranges and the apples. And then you say, what's the color of these fruits? And then you get oranges, and you get an orange, and you get apples. And that way, you're able to classify things. You then say, well, listen, I got a fruit of unknown origin, an FUO, and I want to know what it is. So you bring it down your tree. But now, with computers being so advanced, you don't have to do one tree. You can do 3 trees. You can do 1,000 trees. And each variable will be different. You'll start with diameter. You'll start with color. You'll end up growing in summer. You'll put different variables in each tree. And the idea is you'll run your FUO, or in this case, a patient, and with your question of not is it an orange, but will they die, and you run it through these trees, these 1,000 trees, and you get a majority vote. And you get it's an orange. They will die or not. And that is really how machine learning works in this case. So what do we get? So we started off with our predictors. Again, we chose our predictors not based on any stats. We chose them a priori by doing a literature search, by going to our colleagues, by asking expert opinion what they thought the main variables were that would predict death. We then took our predictors. We had a pool of 22. For a classical model, we used only 13, and that was based on just the power and the sample size that we had. And with the machine learning, we're not really restricted by that, and we used all 22. For the 13, we based that on, again, expert opinion, on asking them to put in a ranking order what they thought the most important variables were. So this, again, you saw some version of this at lunch, but we had 639 patients. We took only the DCD eligible, which were 306, excuse me. Just to know, we ended up with 87 patients who proceeded to DCD, with a quarter of patients that did not die in time with organ procurement and 75% that did. So keep in mind, 300 patients for this part of the study. 60% of patients died within 2 hours is a Kaplan-Meier curve, and you can see, and that's more than half is actually dying the allotted period of time. So we have to do better than flipping a coin for our models. This is a breakdown of the time to death by 30-minute intervals, and the majority of them, about 35%, died in the first 30 minutes, with a drop-off rate there you can see. So let me show you a few tables here. In terms of how we evaluate the model, we looked at a bunch of different things, but I don't want to go through all that with you because I have a bunch of stuff to show you today. The main thing when looking at these models people tend to look at is something called the area under the curve, which basically is a value that incorporates the sensitivity of a model and the specificity. And it gives you a number from 0 to 1. The numbers usually range for models to 0.6, 0.7. A good model will give you 0.8. An excellent model, which is rarely does that, gives you 0.9. So just think of the grading when I mention these numbers. So if you look at our area under the curve for our classical model, again, just using logistic regression, we found an AUC of 0.86. The random forest, surprisingly, gave 0.96, which is almost too good. We then did a 10-fold cross-validation. It's just a way to validate the data with your sample size, where you cut up your data and you incorporate new samples into it. It's a way just to validate it. And you repeat the AUC, and it should be lower, because again, you always get some measure of overfitting, and we get numbers of 0.74 and 0.77. As a sensitivity analysis, we said, we took 300 patients, the DCD eligible. We said, let's take all 600, even though those other patients are not DCD eligible, just out of interest to see does the model actually help us with those patients. We put the entire cohort in this model, and again, we got numbers of 0.84 and 0.92, so excellent prediction with the model. The cross-validation was even better at 0.8 and 0.84, so numbers we were very actually pleased with. This is a list of the variables that were in the model and their odds ratio. I will not go through each one of these, But what I will show you, the two important ones that we saw. The two most powerful ones were GCS, which gave us an odds ratio of 2.37. And I think what's really fascinating is we had a variable in there called physician prediction. At the time of WLSM, we asked the physicians, we said, what do you think the patient's time to death will? Will they progress within 2 hours? What's your probability, low, medium, or high? And we had a scaling system. We put this as a variable, and we saw the odds ratio at 7.21. This by far is the most powerful variable in the whole model, which was very interesting. Reasons for that is, I think it's hard to know. I think physicians have access to real-time data. Anytime we have a model, we have one blood pressure at one point, and that goes in the model, but the patient's had about 1,000 blood pressures there, and the physician and the human mind can probably incorporate that to some degree better than one single point in time. Along the same lines, the physician understands the patient trajectory because he has all that data at hand and probably can make a better prediction. So this is our model statistical machinery. So we put in physiological variables, we put in demographic and comorbidities, we put in physician prediction into the model, and we squeezed it and put it through a statistical grinder, and we get an outcome. There's one variable I want to talk about we also put in, and that is withdrawal of life support measures method. We said, listen, physicians do things differently. This guy will extubate, this person won't. She'll stop vasopressors, he won't. And that probably affects how you die, or at least that was our thought. And so we said, let's put a variable in the model. And even though it's a post hoc variable, meaning our data it happened after the decision to withdraw, in the future, if I gave you a model and you knew that you were somebody who did not extubate, for example, on DCD, you could put that into this model, and it'll give you a different prediction than if you didn't have that variable. So we thought it was worth putting it in. But this got us thinking. And this brings us to sort of part two of the talk, is how do people actually withdraw life support? What does it mean to withdraw life support? And specifically, what do the people do? Do they take a cardiac approach where they stop vasopressors? Do they mainly focus on the ventilator in the lungs where they'll extubate a patient or not extubate and just do reduction of the ventilator settings? And how do the drugs fit into this? How do the opioids, what do people do with their opioids during DCD? So this really brought us to question two. Is the withdrawal life support measures different for DCD candidates than non-DCD? This question is sort of born out of this paper, which is this famous 2006 recommendations for DCD. And this comes out of the line, the management of the dying process, yada, 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 should proceed according to existing ICU practice and not be influenced by donation potential. So what that really means, essentially, is like a prime directive for DCD, is thou shalt not do anything different. This is what I was taught when I was a fellow, and this is what we teach our fellows, and this is what it is. When you do a DCD and you do withdrawal, it should not be different than how you do it on any other patient in the ICU, because you should not be influenced by the donation, potential donation for that patient. And this is what we follow. And so the question is, can we look at this within this database and see, is that actually what happens? So these are the different approaches to withdrawal that we found in the data. And this was confusing to me because there was a lot of different approaches. People, I don't know if you can see this, some people just extubate patients and don't do anything else. Some people just stop the vasopressors and leave the tube in. Some people will reduce the ventilator. Some people reduce the ventilator and the vasopressors. Some people have a multi-step ventilator reduction approach. Well, they'll stop the PEEP, then they'll reduce the FiO2, et cetera, et cetera. That was a bit too much for me, and given our sample size, we couldn't look at that variable in such detail to get any sort of meaningful signal. So we said, what's the meat of it? Essentially, if you extubate somebody, and if you stop their vasopressors within, at the time of withdrawal, we took that as our main signal. Everything else, every other sort of variation of that, we took as basically weaning, and that's how we modeled this. Because those are the most aggressive physiological things one can do when one is withdrawing. So we looked at vasopressor. I want to just maybe expand on vasopressors. It's a word I'm using. I don't mean it just to mean norepinephrine or phenylephrine. I mean in any cardiocirculatory or cardiac drug, any inotrope. I just don't feel like saying vasopressor and inotropes for the next 20 minutes. So it includes dobutamine, dopamine. We included devices, so ECMO, balloon pumps, any cardiac assist devices in that vasopressor arm. We looked at any withdrawal within 30 minutes, any change within 30 minutes of the withdrawal, because there's documentation. Maybe your intent is to take out the tube and stop the vasopressors at time 0, but it takes time. You got to get something, you got to chart it. So we gave them a 30-minute window. So again, we had 639 patients. I'm showing this again because for this part of the study, it's a bit of different patients. The DCD eligible was 200 patients. And then the ones that didn't proceed to DCD was 116. So these are DCD not attempted, but they were eligible. And then we had 89 patients who actually proceeded to DCD. So essentially, our control groups for this part of the study are these two, DCD not attempted and DCD attempted. And those are our numbers. The first question we looked at, we said, look, is the way you withdraw associated with time to death? I mean, we had that in our model. Is it actually associated? Funny enough, vasopressors, the odds ratios were a bit elevated, but not significant here. But really, for extubation was where we had the greatest signal. And we looked at 30 minutes, 1 hour, and 2 hour. And we found odds ratios of your odds of associated of dying was around 2.5, always 2.5, and being significant. And that's just, I think, common sense to most of us, but just to show that it was bore out in the data. So the main question here is there a difference between DCD attempted and not attempted in how the withdrawal method? So we looked at the vasopressor and the respiratory. For the vasopressor method, we found that people basically almost always stopped the vasopressors, around 92% and 98% in whatever group you were. It was easy, you turned it off. That was a main thing that people did. The respiratory was a bit different. So here again, attempted, not attempted. Patients extubated 83% of the time if they were going for DCD versus 64% if they didn't go for DCD. Said another way is that 32% of patients were not extubated if they didn't go for DCD, but only about 5% were not extubated in the DCD with a statistical significant p-value. Now, I think these are clinically different and suggest a different, maybe a different attitude with regards to extubation depending on your group. What about opioids? How was the use of opioids affected in this group? So just to show you some overall data, what we did for opioids, which was really quite painful to do, but going over the data, we took all of the different types of opioids and we basically made them into a morphine equivalent. So what you're looking at all is whatever drug it was, we used published sort of conversion factors, and we converted everything to morphine. And we put them as bolus, drips only, or both. And around 10% of patients for withdrawal in both groups only got boluses. The majority got drips, and then 22% got drips and boluses. And these are the doses. And they're not actually tremendously large doses, in all fairness. This is at 6 milligrams an hour in the drips, a total of 38 if you got milligrams of morphine if you got both. Okay, so what do we see? Again, DCD attempted, not attempted. These are the mean doses here. We see differences. If you got boluses only, we see 21 milligrams versus 12 milligrams, but again, clinically different, but I'll show you wasn't statistically different, and no real difference whether it was a drip or whether you got both. So you can see those means there. Now, what we did is we looked at the means, we combined all that, and we basically looked at a mean difference, and we said, is there a difference between these groups? And in fact, even though it's 17 milligrams of DCD attempted and 11 here, there was no statistical difference. Okay, great. So for the second time in the study, we said, let's do some further thinking about this. And we thought time plays a role. It's a bit hard to get around this, but if you withdraw on a patient and they live for 10 hours, and you compare to that patient who basically lived for 1 hour, the patient who lives for 10 hours is going to get a lot more morphine just by the virtue that they survived. And therefore, your signal association may go in a different way. So you're not comparing like to like. And so we thought we need to actually incorporate time into our analysis. And the second thought is, are these patients different? Are the patients who die quickly in the first 30 minutes or first 20 minutes, are they different than the patients that don't die? I mean, again, we're trying to get at the decision or the acts that the physician makes or the healthcare team makes at the bedside. And you can imagine, you have a patient at the bedside who's on 100 of Levophed, 10 of PEEP, or 20 of PEEP. You know that patient's going to die in about 30 seconds as you withdraw those things. That patient will be treated, or potentially treated differently than the patient who's on no vasopressors and stable on the vent. And the actions in terms of opioids may be different. So we separated out these two groups of patients. So let me show you here. What we have here is the mean difference. Again, the difference in morphine between the patients who DCD attempted and who went for DCD. And here, according to time. So 30 minutes, 1 hour, and 2 hours. There was no difference in the first 30 minutes in the opioid level between the two groups. As we went to 1 hour, we see a difference of about 4 milligrams, these are p-values here, but there's no difference. As we go to 2 hours, we see a 12 milligram difference with a significant difference. So the people who died within 2 hours, there was about a 12 milligram difference in morphine equivalents. I think this is quite interesting if you can just bear with me for a second. So again, here we have the mean difference. And again, we broke them to 4 times this time. We have 30 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours, and 3 hours. This line represents a 2-hour mark, which is our 2-hour mark of DCD. We have two bars here. We have the dark blue and the light blue. The dark blue represents the patients who died within those time periods. The light blue are the patients who did not die. If you look at all the patients that died here, within 30 minutes, this is from what I showed you previous graph, we see an increase in the mean difference up until 2 hours and then drops off by 3 hours, with the p-value being significant and dropping off. Again, the p-values are here just to show you as a signal of significance. Of course, these are a lot of tests here, and we can argue the value of that, but just to show you, to get an idea of a signal. If we take the light blue now, I think this is where it's more interesting. These are the patients that did not die. So you're waiting there, you're doing a DCD, and the patients are not progressing. And we're talking about here what's happening with their opioid doses. We see a big difference in these patients. We see in the first 30 minutes, a 12 milligram mean difference of morphine with a p-value that's 0.04. We see it within 1 hour again, and it drops off at 2 hours, and it comes to non-significant at 3 hours. And you can imagine that there's this curve here. So, what do we take from this? I think there probably are small differences in the rate of extubation. There are potentially small differences in opioid dosing, but I think this requires a huge grain of salt. We have to keep in mind these are a small sample, even though there's probably no other sample that I know of in the literature like this, because it's really hard to do this retrospectively. But it is still a small sample, and therefore very hypothesis generating. The analysis we're still ongoing, so I'm showing you some new data. We haven't accounted for other sedatives. Maybe the differences in morphine are because actually those patients that got a small dose of morphine were on a higher dose of other sedatives or other sedatives like Versed or propofol, and maybe that's why there's a difference. We need to look at that. We didn't look at yet the units that have protocolized withdrawal orders. Maybe that'll make a difference in the opioid dosing. And we did account for drug kinetics, which makes a difference, how you dose your morphine. If someone is more sensitive to morphine, maybe they won't need as much, and there might be differences, and it's very hard to account for those things. So, the take-home message is that time to death can be predicted using a combination of demographic, physiological, physician prediction, and withdrawal approach predictors. We can develop a good prediction model. I still think there's room to work on that, and there's new novel predictors are needed to improve these models, especially such an important thing as time to death. That may make the difference between a person going for DCD or not going, and therefore organ retrieval. The approach to withdrawal may be different between DCD and non-DCD patients, and I think more researchers need into that. Whatever one is to say, whether it is or is not different, I think the important part is that the work demonstrates the utmost importance of standardized approach to withdrawal, whether it be a checklist, whether it be a standardized order sheet or an audit. The importance of standardizing that and to bring us all together in a transparent way is crucial. That's it. Thank you.